Now, I said earlier that I researched all that and I found that relatively easy to find what the debunking case was and finding sort of scientific verification for those debunking cases in peer-reviewed, respected journals that, you know, architects across the world and structural engineers across the world will all go, that's a reliable scientific journal. The one that absolutely stumped me, literally this morning, I actually rang the New Internationalist, didn't I? And said, look, I think I'm going to have to admit defeat on this one, because I've started looking into thermite, which, you know, wasn't something that I was particularly familiar with until this morning. Excuse me having such a dry mouth, but I do feel quite nervous seeing all this. I started looking into thermite this morning and came across Stephen Jones's paper saying that there were thermite residual particles found in the World Trade Center dust. I started looking around, trying to sort of find information that might show you the opposite side, so saying, well, no, they haven't. I tried to find stuff about, well, it wasn't peer-reviewed, you know, it's just his opinion, other scientists haven't looked at it. But apparently it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. That's when I got absolutely stumped, and I thought, my God, what is going to happen here? Am I going to end up sort of coming to this debate and sort of saying, oh my God, you know, I'm going to have to concede this one? But then something really, really strange happened. I started hunting around for stuff about Stephen Jones, who's the only scientist who says that he's found these thermite particles. Nobody else has confirmed it. It's only Stephen Jones saying that. And no matter how many of the sort of controlled demolition sites you go on, you'll find people just citing him. There aren't any other structural engineers or scientists, qualified people, saying this. It's only Stephen Jones saying it.
My name is Jeff Fair. I have a PhD in Material Science and Engineering from the University of Minnesota. I have a BA in Physics from Brigham Young University. I've worked with solid-state reactions. I've worked characterizing materials, semiconductor materials, thin films. I currently do a lot of work with nanoparticles as well as
And I wasn't aware
of Building 7 until I read a Steve Jones paper in 2005 which talks about Building 7, talks about the strange details and evidences of, surrounding Building 7. And that's what really grabbed my attention and made me want to look more into this. And so I actually looked for Steve Jones, and I sought him out, and we talked for a little bit. I wanted to get a feel for his sincerity and his motivation for doing this, and so we talked a little bit, and then I watched one of his talks that he gave in September of 2005 at Brigham Young University, and we talked some more, and at that time I was working as an electron microscopist. I was characterizing materials, and I thought that I might have something to offer if eventually he was to come across some evidence or evidence was sent to him. And so I offered what I could do to study that and to get some data on any of the evidence that he might collect. So eventually he was able to get some metal samples that were from some of the steel beams from one of the towers, and we studied those. I cut up some of those steel samples and polished them to see what we would find in the steel. some of the pieces that he acquired at the time had some corrosion. They'd obviously gone through some melting, and we thought that those might be significant. So we actually were looking, and I was going in that direction. That's sort of my expertise, solid state reactions, and that's not quite solid state necessarily, but that's certainly in the realm of my expertise. So that's the direction that I wanted to go, was to look at these materials, study the phases, and maybe see what temperatures that these phases would have to or the temperatures that the steel would have to get to create these phases. And then around 2006, I believe it was, Steve started receiving dust samples and started looking at these dust samples. So the study of the metal samples turned up different phases. I did obviously see the steel phase and iron oxide phases. We did find an iron sulfide phase as well as an iron silicate phase. Looking at all the phases, I came to the conclusion that in order to create these phases, we'd have to reach a minimum of about 1100 degrees C. So that was some preliminary work that we did with these steel samples or the steel evidence that Steve was able to get from various people. In fact, one of the samples came from Clarkson University. Some of the steel beams had been sent out to Clarkson College, and they were going to build a monument with these, and there was a lot of debris that was sent with the beams. And some of that evidence came from that debris as well as coming directly off of the steel columns. So that's where these initial samples came from. Obviously, it required polishing these pieces of steel and then putting them in the electron microscope to find, and using X-ray analysis to find the chemistry. I used diffraction to determine the phase or the structure of the phases along with the chemistry. And then in that way we were able to determine the phases that were in the steel or in these pieces of steel that had been corroded or melted, whatever the process they had gone through. That's what we were trying to determine by looking at the phases. So again, we found that the phases that were there probably would require about 1100 degrees C. And that didn't entirely wrap up that part of the study, but that was pretty significant findings. So the question became, how do you get to those temperatures? Obviously, the question of how do you get to 1100 degrees C is significant because you don't get to those temperatures with scattered office fires or even jet fuel fed office fires. You get to maybe half that temperature. So that question of how do we get to 1100 degrees C, that became fairly important to me, and one of the things that obviously made me more motivated to look further into this.
My name is Mark Basile. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I've worked for about 25 years in industry, and the majority of what I do is analytical work and figuring out what materials are composed of, why they are what they are, why they do what they do. It's basically a lot of material science is what I do. I started looking into 9/11 from the beginning. I had some serious questions based on some of my readings. An example there would be the R.J. Lee report and then the FEMA report, Appendix C specifically, that got into some metallurgical analysis of some steel beams that were found from the World Trade Center location, which were actually analyzed by professors at the school that I went to, WPI. When I looked into both the R.J. Lee report and the FEMA report, Appendix C specifically, I just had a lot of questions, so I really started doing a lot more digging into things. And ultimately, in December of 2007, I attended a conference in Boston on 9/11 where Stephen Jones was going to be speaking about his work on the iron-based microspheres. I attended the conference and listened to him talk, where he also, for the first time, discussed his discovery of the red-gray chips that we'll get into a little bit later here. After he spoke, I approached him and I was interested in being put in contact with a source for World Trade Center dust to independently look at the material and either confirm or deconfirm what he had found. About a month later, I received my first sample of World Trade Center dust from Jeanette McKinley, which was one of the individuals that is spoken of in his report on the thermetic materials that he put out in March of 2009, I think it was. So anyway, I received a sample of dust in January of 2008 and basically started working with the material. I found iron-based microspheres in there, just as he had done, and I also found the red-gray chips that he had spoken of. I then began to do some analytical work on them, and I found that their composition was basically exactly what he had described.
My name is Niels Harriet. I have a master and a PhD in chemistry, and I'm associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, and I have been so for almost 40 years. And I'm 65. I have published close to 60 peer-reviewed papers in the best journals, and currently I'm involved with research X-ray time-resolved spectroscopy on time scales of 1/millionth of a second. This is very fast. About 3.5 years ago, I saw accidentally Building 7 going down on a DVD, which was a recording from Stephen E. Jones' lecture he gave on Brigham Young University. And that caught my attention immediately because, for one thing, I have never heard about this building before. And second, I couldn't understand what was going on because apparently it collapsed with no reason at all. So that, as a scientist, I'm trained to trying to understand what's going on around me, and I couldn't understand. And from that day, I have not had any free time because later on, I started looking into it. I started working on the local scene in Copenhagen, Denmark, and I got involved with a team of scientists, which also counts Stephen E. Jones, Kevin Ryan, etc. A total of 9 people, and in a kind of research investigating the dust from the collapse on south of Manhattan. And in the dust we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips, which have different properties. Most importantly is they're still reacting, some of them, and in the reaction they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction, and such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures.